So we wanted Carlos to provide this perspective about the evolution of minimum wages, with some hints also about the effect of the minimum wage directive, and I think he is the best, the most qualified person that can do this. So please, Carlos, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Oscar, and hi to everybody. So as Oscar said, I'm going to present to you basically an overview of minimum wage policy in countries with statutory minimum wages. Over the last decade, in which Eurofound, where I work, we have been doing reviews every year, as Oscar mentioned. And then I will talk a little bit as well about the directive on minimum wages from the European Union and its implications in this context. So, regarding the evolution of minimum wages in Europe, you have here the data, the most updated one, January of this year, minimum wages across European Union countries per hour, right? So, to start with, you see a clear picture here. You see how those countries with the higher minimum wage levels are all from Western Europe, all the member states of the European Union. While on the other hand, on the bottom, you have countries from Eastern Europe, right? Bulgaria and Latvia and Romania, particularly below €5 per hour. So we clearly have a regional divide, but it's very important to have in mind that, for example, if you look at the countries where statutory minimum wages have intermediate levels, you already see countries for Eastern Europe there, like, for example, Poland, Lithuania, or Croatia, for example. And if I had shown you this picture from 10 years ago, that would not have been the case, because basically what happened over the last 10, 15 years has been a huge increase in minimum wage levels in Eastern Europe. So disparities across European Union countries have really narrowed down a lot, even though they are still significant and they exist. So let's see what happened over the last years. So in general, what we can say about minimum wage policy in the last decade is we clearly see, as we have been monitoring this every year, we have seen a change of tone towards minimum wage policy in European institutions and across many countries. The reason for that is, first of all, the recovery after the Great Recession, after the worst of the crisis passed, after 12, 13, 14, countries started to hike minimum wages more significantly. But as well, we find the effect of particular experiences in certain countries where governments have increased minimum wages a lot. So for example, we can mention Slovenia in 2011 already hiked minimum wage by more than 20%. Spain did it in 2019 by more than 20%. Germany, for example, a very important country in Europe, introduced the statutory minimum wage in 2015, then increased a lot in 2022. So all these experiences reflect, much bolder approaches to minimum wage setting. And then all this has been underpinned more recently by the directive on minimum wage policy implemented by the European institutions, which was adopted in 2022. So overall, we see a very significant change in the policy approach to minimum wages. As a result, what we can see, and you see it here, is that statutory minimum wages over the last 10 years have increased quite significantly across European Union countries. At the top, you have the increase, the growth rate in nominal terms, and in the bottom, you have the increase in minimum wages in real terms. So you see that it has increased across all countries, but very significantly in Eastern European countries. So you see how the newer member states that joined the European Union after 2004 have been seeing really very significant progress, more than Western Europe. Then you see this more clearly here. For example, if we separate, so this tells you the change over the last 10 years, and in here I split EU14, which refers to the older member states, and EU13, which refers to the newer member states. So for example, if you look at the top, that's the nominal change. You see how the change has been much, much stronger in the newer member states. And then I show within the older member states, I tried to single out a little Spain, because we're in Spain for this presentation, so I wanted to show that. Spain, and as well Germany in the last years, is a bit of an outlier within Western Europe because the increases have been very significant. So you see very clearly when you see the nominal changes in the top, and when you look at the bottom, that's the real change. Again, the same picture, like very strong, much stronger increases in Eastern Europe, in the newer member states, and quite subdued progress in older member states, with some exceptions, as you can see clear, like Spain or Germany as well, for example, even though you don't have the data here. Something you already see in this picture, for example, if you look at the bottom one that shows change in real terms, in minimum wages, you see how in the years 2002, especially, and 2022, and a little bit as well in 2023, against the background of the living cost crisis, you see how the progress was halted because of the inflation. And we can see, there was not a massive reduction, but let's say that the progress in real terms in minimum wages was completely halted in 22, it even went down a little bit, and again in 23. And then it starts increasing from 24 onwards. And we can see, for example, what we can say about the living cost crisis, in general, the picture really is that governments really stepped in to protect the purchasing power of minimum wage earners across most countries. So as I told you, price levels started to increase very significantly at the end of 2021. That means that in 22, many countries were caught by surprise, because many times the negotiations had already taken place in the summertime, and the sudden increase in prices came at the very end of 2021. So that resulted in some erosion in purchasing power of minimum wage earners in most of the countries in 22. And in 23, that was less the case already. And then in 24, there was a huge improvement in minimum wage levels that completely offset those reductions in purchasing power of the previous years. And the aggregate picture of the whole period of the living cost crisis, which goes from 21 to 24, is the picture you have here. So this shows the change, the growth rate of minimum wages in real and in nominal terms over this whole episode of the living cost crisis. And you see clearly how, except in those two countries at the bottom, like Slovenia and Croatia, all the rest, minimum wages in real terms have increased over these 4 years. And I think it's important to highlight it because the increase in prices was of such a magnitude, as you know, that for this picture to emerge where purchasing power has been protected by governments and even increased in most countries, the necessary increases in nominal rates in minimum wages have been massive. As you can see here, for example, in the dots in orange, governments had to increase over these 4 years minimum wages by 40, 50% in some cases. So really the increase has been really something that has to be highlighted. The picture we see is that, governments really stepped in to protect minimum wage earners, despite these small reductions in 22 and in 23 in a few countries. As a result of this very important progress in minimum wages over the last 10 years, we see that the increase in minimum wages in general has been higher than the increase in average wages across most countries. So basically, pay levels at the very bottom of the distribution have increased more than the average wage levels in the economy. So as a result of that, the KAITS index in most countries, the KAITS index measures the ratio between the minimum wage and the average wage. So you see how in most countries, the KAITS index has increased. For example, Spain is the country where it increased the most. You have Germany as well with a significant increase, and some other countries on the left-hand side. But in general, the picture of pay levels among minimum wage earners have been really positive over the last 10 years compared to the aggregate of the population. And then we see that this continues to happen. This, for example, this data tells you the change in this year, so what happened, not looking at the last decade, but just looking at what happened in this year from January 25 to January 26, where minimum wages have been hiked across countries. Typically, rates are decided in January. So this tells you the growth in real and in nominal terms across European Union countries with statutory minimum wages. And again, you see the same picture. You see how minimum wages in real terms, which are the blue bars here, are increasing almost across all European Union countries except the two at the bottom. And again, very significant increases in Eastern Europe, like in this case, Slovenia, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, Cyprus, with the highest increases. So for this year, we see like inflation. This is something that may change over the course of this year, but in January, that was not still the case. So what we saw in January compared to a year before is that inflation levels were going, moderating. It was like, less than 2% in January 26, while it was almost 3% in January 26. But still, the hikes in nominal rates were quite comparable to what happened a year ago. So as a result, that's why we see those increases in purchasing power in minimum wage earners. We will have to see how this picture, of course, is going to change depending on how the current inflation situation evolves because of the current situation. But in principle, in January, the picture was positive across most countries. And what we have identified when we dig a little bit deeper into the reasons for these hikes in this year, we see that a growing number of countries are using the reference thresholds mentioned by the European Union directive when deciding their rates. We saw that already in 24 in some cases, more countries in 25, and certainly more countries in 26. So we see how countries are, typically setting some rates, like deciding, okay, we want to have a minimum wage that is going to reach the level of 50% of the average wage or any other value. It could be 48 or 47, or in some cases using the median as a reference. We want to hike it to 60% of the median. For example, that's the case in Spain in the last years. So we see really these reference thresholds being increasingly used across countries. So I'm going to tell you, against that background, a little bit about the directive. So as you know, you will be very aware of this. So the directive was adopted at the end of 22 to be transposed within 2 years. There were two main articles for minimum wage setting. Article 4 was about promoting collective bargaining. And then the one we are more interested at here, Article 5, about the setting of statutory minimum wages. So what the directive said, you have the text here, basically was asking countries to include some elements that should be included as national criteria to hike minimum wages. And you have those 4 criteria here, basically the purchasing power, the general level of wages, the growth rate of wages, and national productive development. That text was included by most countries. And then at the bottom as well, the directive was mentioning, that member states shall use indicative reference values, such as 50% of the average wage or 60% of the minimum wage when deciding on minimum wage levels. It's important, of course, to say directive doesn't force any country to adopt this in a mandatory way. It just uses that as an example, but as I tell you, we see that in practice, a lot of countries are kind of using these reference thresholds. Then, at the end of last year, it came the ruling of the Court of Justice, because as you know, Denmark asked for the directive to be annulled. So the ruling of the it was your fault. But the good news, well, is that they didn't get it. So, so basically what happened is the directive, what they ask, the changes in the directive after the ruling basically is they killed this criteria because the court said that was a step too much of a step into the national decision-making process. And it will imply certain level of homogenization in the way things are deciding for minimum wage setting. So that text disappeared from the directive. All the rest, regarding Article 4 on social dialogue, and regarding these reference thresholds that I told you about, the 50, the 60%, They were kept because the court said that that's not a mandatory thing to do by member states. So it's something that they can consider, but it's not mandatory. So against the background of this ruling, what I can tell you is basically it means that most of the contents of the directive are valid. In practice, we see that most of the countries by the end of last year, they had already included even those elements that have been cancelled. They were included in national regulations. We don't know what's going to happen, but we doubt countries are going to go into the trouble of going in regulations and delete those references. So I think in most cases, they will be kept anyway in national legislations. And then these reference thresholds, as I told you, which are playing an increasing role, they will stay as well. And just very briefly, as I say, like what we see already is that many countries already included those thresholds. For example, those countries in green, either pale green or dark green, we see those thresholds being included in national legislation. Then we have other cases, like for example, Spain and Germany, where it's not included in regulations, but as a result of political agreements, where, you know, in the case of Spain, for example, was the ad hoc commission on minimum wage setting. In the case of Germany, is the minimum wage commission. They have included a reference to those thresholds. And so because of that, what we see is really, you know, that the aim of the directive is basically to have adequate minimum wages. So as I told you, I would say we have two dimensions for that. One, it refers to the fairness of minimum wages, you know, how they compare to average wages, which is the thing tackled by these reference thresholds. And we see a lot of action there in member states, because you see here how countries have implemented, you know, reference to median, average wage thresholds, and are aiming to reach certain levels in the minimum wage setting. There is a second area of adequacy of minimum wages, which refers more to the area of decent standard of living, which refers to what extent minimum wages are enough for people to have a decent standard of living. And that's a much more complicated dimension of adequacy, because it involves not only taking into account the minimum wage level regarding average wages, but, you know, to what extent minimum wages allow you to cover housing or, you know, different baskets of goods. And that's a bit more a complicated situation, because it's not the same if you are living by yourself on a minimum wage or if you are living in a household where 3 people are working. So it's something that really involves, you know, countries deciding on which studies they can use, you know, like representation of different households. And that's something where we expect maybe more things are going to happen in the future, but so far, this is not something that has been really tackled in countries. We have some examples like Slovenia, where this is done on a normal basis to decide on the increases in minimum wages, because they calculate a basket of goods and services, including housing, etc. But that's not the case in many other countries. So this is an area where we expect more action in the future. So yeah, I think that's it. As I told you, like, I will say, as a summary, you know, big emphasis in minimum wage policy in the last years across European Union countries and institutions. A lot of progress in minimum wages in last years in nominal and real, very especially in east of Europe, which has been a huge convergence within the European Union because of that. And then, you know, we saw how really countries stepped in during the living cost crisis in 21 to 24. Let's see to what extent this is going to replicate this year or over the next months, and what countries are going to do this time. But I will say the picture from what happened this last time is quite positive in protecting minimum wage levels. And then, as I said, minimum wage directive, most of it is still valid, and we see it has a growing influence in minimum wage setting across countries. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Carlos. Maybe we can collect if there are questions very rapidly, and then we move to the overview given by Karen before the roundtable. There's Christian, and then Joao. There is the micro.
It was clear it was going to be the Danish.
You? Yeah. Oh, There you go. All right. Castellana, not responsible for the Danish government's actions. No, it's a great presentation. Thank you so much. Really, really helpful. I was just wondering if, so we talked before the break about how low-income groups were especially hit, like their composition of their basket, especially hit. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about that in your, when you talk about the value of the minimum wage in particular countries, if there is there anything that you could sort of do to adjust for that? Because I think that's at least something that we've talked a lot about in this project. I don't know if there is, but if there is, fantastic.
Yeah, João Monteiro from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Thank you for the presentation. So statutory minimum wage is great for protecting low-income groups, reducing inequalities. My question is how that links to the broader economic development strategy of different regions, and this might be a question that you might not be able to answer based on your work, which is more quantitative and comparative, I guess, so maybe we can go into the roundtable section afterwards. But where I'm coming from is from this literature that, links national wage developments with broader international dynamics. And so this literature says that Eastern Europe relies a lot of low labor costs, low taxes and all of that. And so with the goal of attracting foreign direct investment, right? So if you have minimum wages going up, that might have an impact on the economic growth strategies of the region. So I was wondering how that might be perceived in the region and how that tension is kind of addressed and balanced.
Thank you, Carlos, for such an interesting presentation. I would like to consult you if you have any result about the interaction between minimum wages raises and a significant reduction in in-work poverty or things like that. Thank you.
Yes, another question about more data. This database on negotiated wages that you were talking about, is there already some insights that you can share with us? How does do minimum wage develop with regard to negotiated wages?
Rob Riedel, German Trade Union Confederation, and thanks a lot, Carlos, for your overview and presentation. I have a short question regarding the importance of the minimum wage in the different countries. You said a lot of the level and adjustments and increases in the last years. So what about the importance? So how many workers are affected by the minimum wage in the different countries? That's, yeah, that would be nice to know. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for all the questions. A lot of good questions, honestly. I'm going to go in order. Okay, so about the low pay, that's super relevant. But I mean, based on what I know, I think only France, if I'm not mistaken, is one country that uses inflation, not the general level of inflation, but one that it's very aimed at measuring the price effect on very low pay people. Because they give more importance to food and things like that. So I think France is the only country where they decide on the minimum wage increase based on this factor. I don't think any other country does it.
Denmark does, but we don't.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, in the statutory. And I don't think, for example, Eurostat publishes that type of comparative data. So that's why we don't use it either. And, we don't do that type of analysis. But I think, and that's something that came up in the previous discussion, I think that's super relevant. And it will be very important if, Eurostat will be able to provide that type of comparative data, because I think it will allow us to be much more specific about the price increases that affect most minimum wage earners, not the whole population. Then about the question about the regions, and it's a very good question as well. But for example, you mentioned Eastern Europe. The fact is that Eastern Europe, even though you see that huge increase in statutory minimum wages. The fact is that wage levels in general have really increased a lot. So in fact, for example, when I say that these kites index have increased in most countries, in a lot of Eastern European countries didn't really increase that much, like in some Western countries like Spain, for example, because really the whole wage levels across the whole population really increased even more than the minimum wage, you know. So I'm not sure it will penalize them, the minimum wage in this context, like in the sense of, you know, not allow them to be competitive or anything like that, because the whole economy is really growing a lot. But of course, the concern about, you know, whether you hike a lot minimum wages, you make it more difficult for some economic activities. That's a very, you know, obvious question in the literature. And, you know, we know there's these employment effects sometimes, even though we know that is not so strong as we thought before, but they may exist, you know. And in cases like Spain in 19, there is some literature that says that, you know, there could have been some negative impact on employment creation. So that's something minimum wage setters have to always consider, of course. About the interaction of minimum wages with poverty and in-work poverty, that's something we have looked many times ourselves in our studies. What I can say just very briefly is the link exists, but it's not so strong as people think. You know, like if you really want to reduce poverty, the best measure is not increasing minimum wages, because, for example, I think in the United States, it may be more the case that even when in a household everybody is working, they are still poor, you know. But in Europe, the main cause really for being in poverty is when in the household, a lot of people don't work, you know. So if you are working, most of the people in the household, you are not in poverty. So that's why the link between minimum wage policy and poverty it exists, but it's not that strong, you know. I don't think minimum wages should be seen as a poverty alleviation policy. I don't think it's the right one. And then your question about the negotiated wages, I cannot really tell you, because it's a different unit in Eurofund that deals with this. I don't really know the data that well. What I know is that you mentioned this morning. Okay.
We did the report.
Yeah, okay.
There is a report out there on this, where we explain the data.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I wanted to say is what I know is that, for example, in the living cost crisis, but you discussed that this morning, governments, because they decide every year, they were able to step in a fastest way, at least in countries with the statutory minimum wages. You know, I think the increases in statutory minimum wages in the living cost crisis was stronger than in negotiated wages, at least in those countries with the statutory minimum wages. Maybe in Denmark, not like that. But, you know, governments were more able to act quickly than negotiated, because sometimes negotiated go for 2-3 years, you know, and then it takes longer to renew the contracts. And then very good question, the last one about the number of workers affected. That's a very good question because, yeah, I mean, for example, I will just give you the example of Spain. Like, of course, the Spanish minimum wage has improved a lot over the last years, but at the same time, you have to realize, you know, when the minimum wage was much lower in 2018, in practice, nobody earned the minimum wage. You know, it was like, I think 1% of the population, or 1.5, was earning the minimum wage because it was relatively low, and then in collective bargaining, they were increasing the, you know, the levels based on that floor. Now, because the minimum wage increased a lot, the statutory, I think the latest estimates are like more than 10% of the population is earning the minimum wage. You know, so you have to always remember as well, you know, having the low minimum wage doesn't mean people is really earning the minimum wage necessarily, you know. And we certainly see across most countries, the people earning minimum wages has increased over the last 5-10 years as a result of those very strong increases. So yeah, thanks a lot.
I think, Francesco, if you go to and get the micro, please. There. One very short question, and then we move to Karen's presentation.
Yeah, just a question of, yeah, the French case is, you know, is in probably, maybe I'm wrong, but it's the only country where in the minimum wage, statutory minimum wage is indexed to this. There is a specific formula on inflation considering. But so the rest of the example, the countries that you mentioned, if I'm not wrong, are all governmental decisions with more or less consultation with social parties. But so the question raised is that of maybe the political will of the government. Okay, in this conjuncture, they decide to step in and to significantly affect the problem of wage distribution. And you show that in this conjuncture, 2021, 2024, 25, there is a significant increase in real minimum wage too. But what if we look at the larger span of time? Maybe some factors like political partisanship can factor in this in the long-term effects of statutory minimum wage. And the other point is the macroeconomic effects, okay, of a minimum of SMW, but also microeconomic effects. I mean, at a moment when, as you said, 10% of the population is covered by minimum wage levels, I was wondering whether if you are reflecting somehow on the impacts that it has in a workplace, like in incitating individual productivity, if business firms are concerned about this kind of compression could have some microeconomic effects. Thanks.
Thank you. So the first part of your question, I mean, it's a political decision to a certain extent in most countries because the level of discretion of governments to decide on this is very large. Even in France, which is less the case, even when France decides every year on the increase, there's a third of the formula they use that it's politically, you can decide politically if you top up a little bit or you bring it down. So that's the case in all countries with the statutory minimum wages, which France is one of them. But yeah, for example, there are some countries like France and Germany as well, to some extent, that use some formulas, so they try to make it more objective, the decision making. And I think that's what the directive was trying to do, I think, in a way. You always have the political discretion to do whatever you want, but I think the objective of the directive, including those criteria, was to try to make the process a little bit objective in terms of, trying to use some, not formulas, but, some indicators, and that will allow you to decide in a more objective way, if you want to call it. But at the end, of course, political will is important to decide what you're going to do with the minimum wages. And then the second part, it's a very complex question to reply, really. I mean, there's a lot of effects. There's a lot of literature, about disemployment effects, to what extent they exist, are they significant or no, which groups they affect, how they affect to firms. It can be positive in the sense that maybe you make it easier for employers that compete via quality rather than via lower prices, to operate in a world with higher minimum wages, but there can be other negative impacts as well. For example, in Germany, I think they saw one of the consequences of the introduction of minimum wages that there was some compression, I think, of wages at the bottom of the distribution. And to a certain extent, this happened a little bit in Spain over the last years. Once the minimum wage became much higher, there is a compression of wages around minimum wage levels. So, it's a matter of every country, what the data tells you. I don't know, there are many different channels. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carlos.